You're lying in a hospital bed. Machines are beeping. Your heart slows. You feel it. This is the end. Everything fades to black. But then, you wake up. Same room, same body, same world. Except the people around you look confused. They thought you were dead. But you're not. Somehow you're still here, still conscious, still you. Now pause and ask yourself, what if this wasn't a fluke? What if you can't die? Not in your experience, not in your reality. What if your consciousness, like a stubborn spark, keeps shifting into the timelines where it survives, again and again and again? That's the idea behind quantum immortality. It sounds like science fiction, maybe even nonsense, but the strangest part is, it comes straight out of real quantum physics. And it all starts with something that's already weird enough on its own. The quantum theory that says every time something could happen, it does, in a different branch of reality. So, what does that mean for you? What does it mean for death? And what kind of world would it be if you are the only one who never dies? Let's back up for a second. Most people hear the word quantum and think of teleportation, time travel, or Marvel characters turning into dust, but none of that has anything to do with why physicists actually lose sleep over it. Here's the real problem. In the world of quantum mechanics, things don't behave like things. You take an electron, for example. You want to know where it is. You expect it to be in one place, right? But the math says, no, it's not in one place. It's in every possible place at once, until you check. And when you finally do look, suddenly it's in just one location. Why? Nobody really knows. They just call it a collapse, which is another way of saying, don't ask. That's where things get weird, and not in the universe is mysterious kind of way. It's weird in the fundamental rules of everything we thought we understood just kind of fall apart here kind of way. This isn't just about tiny particles doing funky dances. This is the very foundation of matter. Everything you're made of, everything around you, behaves like this at the smallest scale. It's like the building blocks of the universe are trying to mess with you. Now, to deal with this, physicists came up with different ways to interpret what's happening. And one of the most famous, or infamous, is the Copenhagen interpretation, which says that the act of measuring something causes it to choose an outcome. The wave of possibilities collapses, and you get one result. That sounds nice, but it raises a huge question. Why does measurement do that? What's so magical about looking at something? And who's doing the looking? And here's where the arguments start. Some say consciousness causes the collapse. Others say it's the measuring device. Others say, who knows, just shut up and calculate. But not everyone was okay with that. Back in the 1950s, a physicist named Hugh Everett looked at this whole mess and said, what if we've got it completely backward? Instead of the universe collapsing into one outcome, what if all outcomes happen, but in different realities? And you, the observer, just continue in the version where you saw your outcome. So, if you flip a coin, there's a universe where it lands heads and one where it lands tails. And you split, one version of you sees heads, the other sees tails. Every time something uncertain happens, reality branches. Over and over again. Constantly, infinitely. It sounds ridiculous. But the math checks out. Everett didn't add any magical forces or new particles. He just took the existing equations of quantum mechanics, the same ones that power lasers, transistors, GPS, and said, let's take these literally. That's the many worlds interpretation. And it changes everything. It means the universe is constantly splitting into versions of itself. Not in some metaphorical way. Literally. Every particle, every decision, every chance event, all of it branches reality. Now, that sounds like just another sci-fi idea, until you realize how many physicists actually take it seriously. Not because they like it, but because it works. It doesn't require collapsing wave functions or magical observers. It just follows the math to its logical end. And if you follow it far enough, something strange starts to happen. You start wondering, what happens when you, the observer, are the one in danger? Enter quantum immortality, a thought experiment rooted in many worlds interpretation. Imagine there's a 1 in a million chance that you survive some accident. According to many worlds, there is a timeline where you die, but there's also one where you don't. And here's the catch. You only ever experience the one where you survive. From the outside, sure, everyone sees probabilities play out normally. People die, accidents happen, life goes on. But from the inside, from your own conscious experience, you're always in the version where you're still here. That's not magic. It's just brutal math, playing out across a multiverse that never stops branching. Now, obviously, this isn't something you can test with an experiment. A dead version of yourself in another branch of the multiverse can't report whether they're experiencing consciousness. But you can ask something even stranger. If your consciousness always persists in the branches where you survive, no matter how improbable, how would you know you're in such a branch? The timelines where you didn't survive would be invisible to you, inaccessible. And the only version left to ask the question is the one where you're still alive. That's the disturbing part. Not that you might live forever, but that from your own perspective, death never happens. Only more survival, against odds, through pain, through anything. And that's where quantum immortality begins to creep in. Before we continue, let me tell you something disturbing I learned recently. Your personal data is probably all over the internet right now. Not just your name, your address, phone number, relatives info, and even things like your political views or shopping habits. And the crazy part is that companies are making money selling that information without you even knowing. That's where Incogni comes in. They track down your personal data on hundreds of people's search sites, shady directories, and data broker databases, and get it removed. And it's not just automated removals. If you find a website with your details, you can send them the link, and their custom removals team will take care of it. Normally, doing this yourself takes hundreds of hours, and even then your data can pop back up again. Incogni keeps sending requests so it stays gone. If you want to take back your personal data, head over to incogni.com/Fexel or use the code FEXEL at checkout to get 60% off an annual plan. That's a small price for peace of mind because they can't harm you if they can't find you. Here's the idea that really messes people up. It's called the quantum suicide experiment. And it's not a joke. It's not a metaphor. It's a thought experiment. And it's the closest thing we've ever come to testing quantum immortality by imagining a scenario where an observer's survival depends on the outcome of a quantum event. The classic setup, proposed by physicist Max Tegmark and others in the 1980s and 1990s, involves a hypothetical experiment. It goes like this. Imagine you build a machine. Inside, there's a quantum trigger, something truly random, like the spin of a particle. Each time you push the button, the quantum system chooses either left or right, 50-50. But you wire the machine so that if it picks left, nothing happens. And if it picks right, the machine pulls the trigger on a loaded gun aimed at you. Now here's the thing. Under normal thinking, you'd have a 50% chance of surviving each time you run the machine. You might survive once, maybe twice, but sooner or later, you're gone. But in the many worlds view, both outcomes happen. There's a branch where you survive, and another where you don't. From the outside, observers watching would see you die about half the time and be horrified. But from your own perspective, something strange happens. You always survive. You push the button, click again, still alive. Everyone around you sees increasing odds of death, but you don't experience those branches. You just keep waking up in the ones where the gun failed to fire. To others, the odds of your death increase with each trial, yet you never experience those branches. You keep waking up in the realities where you survive, defying the odds. In those timelines, you're the lone survivor, beating improbable chances without explanation. That's quantum suicide. It's not a testable experiment. Nobody's doing this in real life, for obvious reasons. But as a thought experiment, it lays bare what quantum immortality really means. It's not about living forever in a physical sense. You still die in most universes. Your family still mourns you in almost every branch. Your friends attend your funeral. Your obituary gets written, but not in your experience. Not in the thread of consciousness you're still riding. And that's the twist. If the many worlds theory is true, then death becomes something that happens to other versions of you, not the ones still asking the question. Now, if this all feels like mental gymnastics, you're not alone. Most physicists are deeply uncomfortable with this idea. It makes consciousness feel slippery and undefined. It blurs the line between science and metaphysics. And to be clear, quantum suicide doesn't prove anything. It doesn't validate quantum immortality. But it does shine a spotlight on just how far the implications of many worlds can go. Here's a more grounded way to think about it. You know how people talk about miracle survivors? The person who walks away from a plane crash, the kid who survives a disease with a 0.001% survival rate, the soldier who's the only one to make it out of an ambush alive. We usually call that luck, or fate, or randomness. But what if it's just the natural result of consciousness following the path where survival always happens? Not because it's meaningful, not because it's divine, but because you're not in the timelines where you didn't survive to ask the question. And this doesn't just apply to near-death events. Even simple stuff, getting hit by a car, having a medical emergency, choking on food. In all of those situations, there's always some tiny fraction of possible outcomes where you make it out okay. And under many worlds, that's all you need. One thread, one timeline, one you that keeps going. That's not optimism. That's the math, if you take this interpretation seriously. Of course, there's a dark side too, and it's not just theoretical. Let's say you do survive every time. Eventually you get older, your body breaks down, you're sick but not dying. You're in pain but still breathing. Your mind is slipping but not gone. And you just keep waking up. Each time worse than before. Each time pushing through a timeline where survival is still possible, even if it's unbearable. If quantum immortality is real, then death isn't the scary part. The scary part is never dying. Being trapped in the branch where life continues, no matter how improbable, no matter how painful. Because that's the only branch you ever experience. And this is the part most people don't like talking about. Because it stops sounding like a theory and starts sounding like a trap. So far, we've been talking about how, in theory, your awareness always ends up in the version of the universe where you survive. But let's pause and ask the most important question no one seems to be able to answer properly. What is that awareness? What is consciousness? Not in some deep philosophical way, just in a basic practical sense. What are we even referring to when we say, you keep surviving? We understand physical things. We understand your heart, your brain, your neurons. We can scan them, poke them, measure them. But there's a big gap between measuring brain activity and explaining what it's like to be you. The part that thinks, that notices, that feels. That's the real problem. We talk about the observer like it's just a technical term, but everything about quantum immortality depends on this observer actually existing and continuing. It's not just a particle bouncing through timelines, it's you staying aware from one survival to the next. But no one can point to what that you is. It's not your brain. Brains die. It's not your body. Bodies get replaced and decay. And it's not even your memories, because those can be erased, changed, or faked, and you'd still feel like you're you. So, what is it? Right now, there's no solid scientific explanation. Neuroscience has made progress in mapping what parts of the brain light up when we think, or feel, or remember. But that still doesn't explain how thoughts even exist. It doesn't explain why there's a first-person experience tied to the process. This gap, often called the hard problem of consciousness, remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in science. From the outside, someone could look at your brain activity and say, yep, there's the survival instinct firing. But from the inside, you're not experiencing electricity. You're experiencing reality, choice, panic, relief, confusion, all the things that don't show up on a graph. And here's why that matters. If quantum immortality is real, then your consciousness, this thing we don't fully understand, is what's shifting into the timeline where you stay alive. But we don't know what that consciousness actually is, or how it knows where to go. We don't know if it's tied to the brain, or if it could somehow continue even if the body doesn't. All we do know is that our experience feels continuous. You go to sleep, you wake up, and you still feel like the same person. Even if your thoughts change or your memories fade, something feels stable across time. That's what makes the idea of you surviving across branches even possible. But here's the catch. If we don't understand what consciousness is, then we have no way of knowing whether it can survive quantum death, or whether that idea even makes sense. The theory kind of assumes consciousness is this invisible thread that keeps going, jumping between timelines like it's switching lanes in traffic. But the truth is, we don't even know if consciousness is a thing that can move at all. That's why a lot of physicists hate this topic. Because to take quantum immortality seriously, you have to deal with consciousness. And consciousness, scientifically, is a mess. It's not measurable, it's not clearly defined, and it doesn't fit neatly into any equation. But if you ignore it, the theory doesn't work. Because quantum immortality isn't about particles surviving. It's about your experience surviving. And that puts consciousness right at the center, whether we understand it or not. So to sum it up, the whole idea hinges on something we can't define, can't measure, and don't fully understand. But it's also the one thing we all live with, every moment we're alive. And somehow, in this theory, it's the only part of you that never stops. Science is about measurable predictions. You build a theory, and that theory has to tell you what will happen if you do a specific thing. Then you go test it. If the result matches, great. If not, the theory needs to change. Quantum immortality doesn't work like that. Because from the outside, from the perspective of anyone observing, the person in the scenario does eventually stop. If they're in a dangerous situation with a low survival rate, eventually, externally, they reach the outcome everyone expects. Their body fails, the situation ends, and that's it. It's only from their internal, subjective experience that something strange happens. And subjective experiences are not testable. You can't prove someone's awareness has shifted to another timeline. You can't measure a branch of reality you can't access. So, the first major criticism is that the theory isn't falsifiable. There's no experiment you can run to confirm it, and no data you can collect to disprove it. That alone is enough for most physicists to say, not science. The second problem is that it ties quantum physics to consciousness, a subject that's already one of the messiest areas of science. Physicists like clean math. Probabilities, particles, forces, things you can put in an equation. Consciousness doesn't fit in. It's still a mystery, and bringing it into an already complicated theory just makes everything worse. Some even say that quantum immortality is a distraction. It pulls attention away from more grounded, testable interpretations of quantum mechanics, like decoherence or pilot wave theory, and replaces them with ideas that sound deep but don't go anywhere useful. Others take it a step further and say it's dangerous to promote this kind of thinking. Not because the idea itself causes harm, but because it might make people take unnecessary risks under the belief that they'll always survive in some version of the universe. That's not how this works, and even if many worlds is correct, the consequences in this branch are very real. There's also a more subtle reason many scientists reject it. It makes them uncomfortable. Not because it's spooky or philosophical, but because it reveals how little we actually understand about what the wave function means, what measurement is, and how experience works in the first place. And if you've spent your life trying to build certainty in physics, it's not fun to be reminded that we still don't fully know what happens when you observe a quantum system. We have working models. They give us correct results, but we still argue over what's really going on under the surface. Some physicists quietly support many worlds because it keeps the math clean, even if they don't like the implications. Then there are a small group, who are willing to say, look, we don't know everything, and until we understand what consciousness actually is, we shouldn't rule out anything that seriously tries to ask these questions. Names like Hugh Everett, who first proposed the many worlds idea, were ignored in his lifetime but are now taken more seriously. Physicists like Max Tegmark have openly talked about quantum immortality. Not to say it's true, but to show that it logically follows if you accept certain premises. And honestly, that's what makes this topic so tricky. You don't have to believe in wild sci-fi ideas to end up here. You just have to follow the logic of one interpretation of quantum mechanics. If the many worlds interpretation is valid, if every possible outcome of a quantum event really happens, then the idea of surviving in the branch where you continue is hard to avoid. So no, this isn't mainstream. It's not accepted in textbooks. Most working physicists won't touch it. But it sticks around anyway because it's not some random theory pulled out of thin air. It's a consequence of a broader theory that's already being debated seriously. And until we can fully explain consciousness or find a better interpretation of quantum mechanics, this idea is going to keep sitting in the background, quietly bothering people who would rather not talk about it. Let's say someone accepts this idea, that their experience might continue in the branches of reality where they survive. What does that change, if anything? At first glance, it might sound like a relief, almost like a safety net. No matter what happens, there's always a branch where you make it through. You don't disappear. You just keep going. But when you really think about it, that kind of survival isn't as comforting as it sounds. First of all, it doesn't mean everything gets better. This isn't a scenario where the person wins the lottery in every timeline or wakes up healthy after every problem. It just means they keep waking up at all. Even if things are falling apart, even if they're sick, isolated, or in pain, as long as it's physically possible for the person to remain aware, even barely, the theory says that's the path their experience follows. That's the part people forget. This isn't about perfect outcomes. It's not about being protected. It's about persistence. And that's not the same thing as well-being. If this theory is right, then in some branches, people go through things they'd never choose. They survive disasters. They keep waking up in hospital beds. They deal with impossible odds again and again. It doesn't stop just because the situation gets worse. It keeps going as long as there's one sliver of a path left to follow. And that raises a hard question. What happens when someone doesn't want to keep surviving? Quantum immortality doesn't care about what someone wants. It doesn't promise happiness or peace. It just says that from their point of view, there will always be one version of the world where they're still in it, still experiencing it, even if they don't understand why. So while it might sound like a cheat code at first, it's actually closer to a slow, grinding process where survival can become more difficult over time. Not always, but eventually. In a way, it changes how you think about risk. Usually, people avoid risk to stay alive. But if survival keeps happening no matter what, does that change how someone lives? Would they take more chances? Stop being careful? Push further than they should? Probably not, because even if a person believes their experience continues somewhere, they still face real consequences in this branch. The pain is real. The outcomes are real. The damage is real. So even if there's some abstract idea of continuing consciousness, it doesn't remove the impact of bad decisions in the world they're actually experiencing. It also doesn't solve the deeper problem. Why does survival matter? If someone keeps waking up, but their life is getting worse each time, physically, mentally, emotionally, is that still a good thing? Or does it eventually become something they wish would stop? That's why the theory feels so different from traditional ideas of immortality. It's not eternal youth, or rebirth, or a legacy that lives on. It's just staying awake in the path that hasn't closed yet. And that can be good or terrifying, depending on where that path leads. Now here's a slightly lighter take. It also means no one else would notice. From the outside, everyone around the person sees the normal outcome. If something fatal happens in most timelines, that's what they witness. They don't see the branch where survival continued. They don't notice the shift. As far as they're concerned, nothing unusual ever happened. So, this experience, if it exists, is invisible. It's private. It's silent. It doesn't leave evidence, and it doesn't affect anyone else. just the person still living through it. And honestly, that makes it kind of eerie. If it's true, it's happening quietly in the background, all the time, and no one knows. There's no confirmation, no test, no proof. Just a theory sitting in a pile of other interpretations, asking hard questions about what it means to be conscious at all. Some people might find that idea comforting. Others might find it overwhelming. But either way, it forces a shift in perspective. From asking, will I survive this? To asking, what kind of version of the future am I going to wake up in next? If you take quantum immortality seriously, even as a thought experiment, there's a strange kind of trap built into it. The idea is that from the person's point of view, they continue waking up in the version of reality where they're still around, even if the odds are against it. Now that sounds harmless enough at first, maybe even a little reassuring, until you start thinking about what that really means long term. Let's say a person survives something unlikely. Great. Then another thing happens, and somehow they pull through again. Still not a problem. But over time, the odds start stacking up. Statistically speaking, their continued survival becomes more and more unlikely. And the outcomes that allow for that survival start looking more extreme. Maybe they pull through a medical condition that should have ended things. Maybe they survive a situation that no one else does. Maybe their health keeps declining, but somehow they don't stop. Even when every branch should have closed, one of them hasn't. And that's the one they keep waking up in. That's where it stops feeling like a theory about survival and starts feeling like a slow slide into isolation. Into timelines where things are barely holding together. Where life continues, but the world around them starts making less sense. Not because the universe is breaking, but because the only branches left are the rare ones. The ones where improbable outcomes have stacked up so high, they feel disconnected from everything else. This is one of the most overlooked consequences of the theory. People think quantum immortality means endless second chances, but it also means being stuck in increasingly rare situations. The path narrows. The familiar timelines fall away. And the person keeps going, alone, confused, trying to make sense of why things feel so off. Some versions of the theory even suggest that this might explain certain fringe experiences, where people feel like something shifted or changed and they can't explain why. Not in a supernatural way, just in terms of probability. If you keep moving forward through the branches where you're still around, it's only a matter of time before the world looks unfamiliar. Simply because the familiar branches are gone. And here's the hardest part. If this happens, there's no one to confirm it. The people in that branch don't know what the others were like. There's no shared memory, no moment of realization, just a growing sense that something's off, and no way to prove it. Now, obviously, this is deep into speculation. Most physicists would stop the conversation way before this point. But if the logic holds, the implications are hard to ignore. Quantum immortality doesn't end in comfort. It just keeps going as long as there's any possibility of continued awareness. So the more someone survives, the more likely they end up in branches where survival comes at a cost. Not just physically, but mentally, socially, emotionally. They might lose people, places, stability, and still keep going. Because that's what the theory says. Not that things get better, just that they continue. And there's no off switch, no point where it says, okay, that's enough. It doesn't care about how long it's been, how tired someone feels, or whether they want to keep going. As long as it's physically possible for a person to still be aware, there's a branch where that happens. And that's where they are. That's why some people think this isn't immortality at all. It's not some gift. It's a long, slow drift into the rarest timelines, where nothing feels quite right, and no one around you can tell the difference. Again, this isn't provable. It's just the logical edge of the theory. But it's not that hard to see how it could happen. If someone keeps surviving against all odds, the odds themselves start to get strange. And the versions of reality where they still exist, those start looking less and less like the life they remember. If you bring up quantum immortality in a room full of physicists, most people won't take the bait. Some will roll their eyes, others might pretend they didn't hear you, and a few will probably just leave. But here's the thing. The idea didn't start in a Reddit thread. It came from actual physics. And the reason it even exists is because a few people at different points in history decided to take quantum mechanics seriously. Maybe too seriously. Let's start with Hugh Everett. He was a graduate student in the 1950s, frustrated by the way quantum mechanics was being taught. Everyone accepted that particles exist in multiple states until they're measured, and then the wave function collapses. But no one could explain what that really meant, or why it happened at all. Everett asked a different question. What if the wave function doesn't collapse at all? What if every possible outcome actually happens, and each one branches off into its own version of reality? He called it the relative state formulation. Today, we call it the many worlds interpretation. At the time, it didn't go over well. Most physicists rejected it. It didn't match the Copenhagen view that had already been widely accepted. Everett's idea was too strange, too abstract, and it didn't give people any new predictions they could test. So he walked away from physics completely. He went into military research and died young, not knowing his work would become a foundation for one of the biggest debates in quantum theory. Decades later, other scientists started to take his work more seriously. Max Tegmark, a physicist and cosmologist, picked up the idea in the early 2000s. He didn't say quantum immortality was real. He just pointed out that if you believe in many worlds, and if consciousness is tied to a physical system like the brain, then subjectively, the observer might continue existing in the branches where that physical system is still functional. That's it. Just logic. No mysticism. Just math plus assumptions. He wrote about it in essays. He talked about it in interviews. And every time he made it clear, he wasn't trying to prove anything. He just wanted people to admit that this is what the theory leads to, whether we like it or not. Then there's David Deutsch, a quantum computing pioneer and another supporter of many worlds. He focused more on the structure of reality, on how quantum computers seem to use parallel versions of reality to do calculations. Again, not directly promoting quantum immortality, but helping to normalize the idea that all possible outcomes could be physically real. None of these people claim to have evidence that consciousness continues across branches. That part remains speculation. But what they did say, clearly and repeatedly, is that if you take quantum mechanics at face value, and if you take consciousness seriously, you end up in a place that starts to resemble quantum immortality. And that's important, because it means this isn't some made-up internet theory. It's the result of smart people following the math to its edge, even if it led to conclusions they didn't want. It's also worth noting that even the critics haven't fully shut the door. Physicists who reject many worlds often admit that it's logically consistent. They just don't like what it implies. It multiplies reality endlessly. It introduces questions we don't know how to answer. And it raises problems about identity, probability, and observation that no one's been able to clean up. But they can't disprove it either. That's why it still exists. It's not popular, but it's not dead. It's just sitting there waiting. Untested, untestable, but not broken. And while quantum immortality itself hasn't been formally accepted or published as a mainstream theory, it's quietly grown as a natural extension of an idea that refuses to go away. Quantum immortality challenges our traditional understanding of death, not as a singular, final event, but as something more fragmented, more elusive. It raises unsettling questions. If consciousness continues in some branch of reality every time it might have ended, does death lose its meaning? Is it diminished by the knowledge that some version of you always survives? Or is it made even more tragic, knowing that countless versions of you do not? Let's assume, just for a moment, that this idea holds not as a confirmed fact, but as a working idea that fits the logic of the theory. There's a version of reality where in every moment that someone could stop existing, there's always a branch where they don't. And from their point of view, they just keep waking up in the one that allows them to go on. Now here's the strange part. If that's how it works, then what we normally think of as death never actually shows up. not in a person's direct experience. From the outside, others will still see what they expect. Things come to an end, people pass away, life moves on. But for the individual at the center of it, they're never aware of that moment. Because by definition, the moment where their awareness ends is a moment they can't experience. It's a strange loop. We treat death as a thing that happens to people, but from the inside, it's not something that can be observed. It's not like sleep, where you wake up later. It's not like passing out, where you come back. It's not even like being unconscious, because even that has a before and an after. Death, real, final, nothing after death, is the one thing no one experiences directly. You can experience almost dying. You can experience coming close. You can experience fading, failing, struggling, but not the actual end. That part isn't a thing that gets recorded. It's just where the tape stops. So if quantum immortality is real, then that moment, the one that never gets experienced, just doesn't happen. At least not for the version of the person who continues. There's always one more branch, one more heartbeat, one more timeline, one more continuation. Not forever in the way people imagine it, not perfect or meaningful, just ongoing. And maybe that's the most uncomfortable part of the theory. Not that it's terrifying, but that it's quiet, that it's subtle, that it doesn't announce itself, that someone could keep living through more and more improbable versions of reality and never realize that this is why it's happening. It also means there's no moment of closure, no grand ending, no final thought. Just the same stream of experience, extending as long as there's a version of the world where it hasn't stopped yet. That flips the question on its head. Instead of asking, what happens after death? The real question becomes, what happens if it never arrives? And not in the fantasy sense, not immortality with superpowers or eternal youth, just a quiet continuation in the sliver of the universe that still supports your awareness, even when nothing else does. It also means the idea of an ending is mostly for the people watching from the outside, the funeral, the closure, the memory. All of that is a part of the timeline where the person didn't make it. And that timeline is real, but not experienced by the version who continues. That version keeps going, even if they don't know how or why. And if that's true, if that's even remotely true, then death in the subjective sense might be something that never happens. Not because we've conquered it or solved it or reversed it, but because in every moment where survival is possible, no matter how slim the odds, there's a branch where you persist. It's not about triumph or transcendence. It's just the mechanics of a universe that never stops splitting. That persistence isn't inherently good, meaningful, or comforting. It's simply relentless. And whether this endless continuation is a gift or a trap is a question no one can answer definitively. Let's be real. You can't prove any of this. Not the theory, not the consequences, not the strange implications about surviving through impossible odds. No one can test quantum immortality, and there's no equation that forces it to be true. Even the people who take it seriously admit it's not science in the usual sense. It's more like following a line of reasoning to its final stop and not looking away when it gets uncomfortable. But now that you've followed it this far, the question shifts. Not, is this real? Because you're not going to get that answer. But what does it change if it is? The truth is, probably not much. Whether the theory is true or not, this is still the branch you're in. This version of your life is still happening. You still have to deal with time, with risk, with chance. You still have to be careful, still have to think about the future, still have to take care of the people around you. Quantum immortality doesn't make you invincible. It doesn't let you cheat reality. If anything, it just reframes what survival might mean. Not as winning, not as thriving, but as simply continuing, even when most versions of the story would have already ended. It also doesn't give you any answers about what you're supposed to do with that information. There's no moral built into it, no cosmic lesson. It doesn't say life has a purpose. It doesn't say it doesn't, it just quietly asks, if experience always continues, what kind of experience are you going to create? And that's where the value might actually be. Not in proving anything, but in recognizing that you don't have to know what's true to start thinking differently. You don't have to solve the mystery to understand what it's pointing at. Because underneath all the theory, all the science, all the speculation, there's still one constant: experience. That thing no one can fully explain, and no one else can ever have on your behalf. Whatever happens beyond this moment, this is still the only moment you have full access to. So, whether quantum immortality is real, wrong, half right, or completely missing the point, you're still here. And for now, that's all there is. If you're still thinking about this, there's probably a reason. And if you're still here, that's exactly the point.